Her businessman accidentally reunites with his long-lost son and must prove he never abandoned him. Amid lies and emotions, a journey of redemption and fatherly love begins. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing, the streets of central London buzzed under the midday heat. Among the imposing skyscrapers and sidewalks crowded with hurried passers-by, Anthony Miller, 43, walked with firm steps towards the hotel where an important business meeting was to take place. His impeccably cut Italian suit and Swiss watch on his wrist revealed his status as a successful businessman, owner of one of the country's largest supermarket chains. A shout echoed among the buildings, "Stop, thief!" Anthony, by instinct, turned towards the commotion. A skinny boy, no more than 8 years old, ran desperately down the sidewalk, followed by a corpulent, middle-aged man who pursued him with a furious expression. People moved away, creating an improvised corridor for the urban chase. The boy, dressed in a faded t-shirt and worn-out shorts, tripped over a protrusion on the sidewalk and fell right at Anthony's feet. It was at that instant that something caught the businessman's attention. On the boy's slender wrist, a gold bracelet gleamed under the scorching sun. It wasn't just any piece of jewelry. Anthony would recognize that design anywhere. A child's bracelet engraved with the name Michael and a date, 12/08/2021. Time seemed to freeze. Anthony felt his legs weaken and his heart race in a painful arrhythmia. That bracelet. It was identical to the one he had ordered 4 years ago for the birthday of his missing son. Michael. The name escaped his lips like a prayer, a whisper laden with 4 years of pain and hope. The boy, still on the ground, raised his frightened eyes to the man in the suit. For an instant, Anthony glimpsed something familiar in those eyes. The same greenish-brown, the same almond shape, the same curious expression that had branded his memory like a hot iron. The boy sprang to his feet, clearly disturbed. "You know my name?" he asked with a trembling voice. "Michael, is it really you?" Anthony extended a trembling hand, fighting the urge to embrace the child who could be his son. The boy recoiled, frightened. "Men in suits like you hurt poor children," he said, with an accent typical of the London East End. "Aunt Constance warned me." The man who was chasing the boy finally reached them, panting. "This kid stole an apple from my stall," he bellowed, pointing an accusing finger at the boy. "I didn't steal anything," the boy protested. "Tommy took it and put it in my backpack to blame me." Anthony, still in shock, could barely process the argument. His mind was fixed on the bracelet, on the possibility of having found his missing son 4 years earlier. "How much is the apple?" Anthony asked, pulling his wallet from his pocket with trembling hands. "It's not just the apple, it's the disrespect," the man complained. "These street kids come here thinking they can take whatever they want." Anthony took out a £100 note and handed it to the man. "Does this cover the damage?" The man looked at the note, surprised, and his expression changed instantly. "Look, sir, you don't need to give all this. Keep the change," Anthony cut in, turning his attention back to the boy, who had taken advantage of the distraction to start slipping away. "Michael, wait!" Anthony called, taking a few steps towards the boy. The boy stopped, turning with a suspicious expression. "How do you know my name, mister?" "That bracelet on your arm," Anthony pointed, his voice choked. "I know where it comes from." Michael looked at his own wrist and instinctively covered the jewelry with his other hand. "It was a gift from my mother, Constance. She said it's the only memory from my life before my father abandoned me." Each word was like a dagger to Anthony's chest. "I would never abandon my son," he murmured, more to himself than to the boy. At that moment, a group of boys appeared at the end of the street, calling for Michael. The boy looked at them and then at Anthony, clearly divided between curiosity and fear. "I have to go," he finally said. "The boys are waiting for me to shine shoes in the square. Michael, please, can we talk?" "Just for a minute," Anthony pleaded. The boy hesitated, but fear won. "Rich men in suits only want to harm poor children," he repeated like a learned mantra. And before Anthony could say anything else, Michael darted down the sidewalk, joining the other boys, who quickly disappeared among the passers-by. Anthony stood paralyzed, watching his son disappear once more. His legs gave way and he leaned against a lamppost as the tears he had held back for so long finally streamed down his face. The businessman was in shock, trying to process what had just happened. His son, whom he believed lost forever, was alive. Alive and seemingly healthy, but believing he had been abandoned by his father. The idea was so absurd, so cruel, that Anthony felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. Who could have told such a terrible lie to a child? Who would have stolen his son just to fill his head with falsehoods? People passed by him, some casting curious glances at the well-dressed man openly weeping in the middle of the sidewalk. But Anthony didn't care. The world around him had disappeared. He could only think of Michael, his frightened eyes, the fear he displayed, the terrible words he had spoken. "He hates me," Anthony whispered, feeling the weight of those words. "My own son believes I abandoned him and hates me for it." The feeling was devastating, but something stronger was growing within him, a fierce determination. He had found Michael after 4 years of relentless searching. He wouldn't lose him again. This time he would uncover the truth, however painful it might be, and bring his son back home. Anthony cancelled the meeting and returned to his apartment in Kensington, a spacious duplex overlooking Hyde Park. As soon as he closed the door behind him, it was as if a floodgate had opened in his mind, unleashing an avalanche of memories he had unsuccessfully tried to keep under control all those years. The day of the disappearance returned with painful clarity. It was a sunny spring, Sunday, October 17th, 2021. The family was gathered in the garden of the mansion they owned at the time in Wentworth Estate. Michael, just 4 years old, was playing on the lawn while Louisa, his wife, prepared a surprise for their wedding anniversary. Edward, Anthony's older brother, had arrived early to help with the preparations, bringing gifts for his nephew, Constance. The housekeeper, who had worked for the family for over 10 years, was in charge of looking after Michael, while the adults organized the party. Anthony remembered perfectly his last words to his son. "Daddy will be back soon, champ. Obey Aunt Constance, okay?" And Michael waved, smiling with that dimple on the left side of his face, identical to his father's. 15 minutes later, a scream tore through the morning's tranquility. Constance ran inside the house, desperate, shouting that Michael had disappeared. She said she had left him playing on the swing for a few minutes while she went to the bathroom, and when she returned, he was no longer there. The property turned into chaos. Anthony and Edward ran around the grounds, calling for Michael. Louisa went into shock, repeating her son's name like a litany. The security guards at the gate swore that no one had entered or left with a child. Within an hour, the police had taken over the scene. The following days were a blur of interrogations, fruitless searches, and sleepless nights. The police initially suspected the parents, as was standard practice, but soon dismissed that possibility. Then came suspicions about Constance, which were also investigated and filed due to lack of evidence. The housekeeper seemed genuinely devastated and cooperated with all investigations. False leads emerged, a witness who claimed to have seen Michael in Manchester, a man asserting he had spotted him in a van on the south coast, a woman who guaranteed she had recognized the boy in a shopping mall in Birmingham. Each lead generated a new wave of hope, followed by an even deeper abyss of disappointment. Opportunists also emerged, people who called demanding money, claiming to have information about the boy's whereabouts. Anthony paid several of these blackmailers before learning his lesson. None of them had anything but lies to offer. It was like dying every day, Anthony murmured to himself, pouring a generous measure of whiskey as he wandered through the empty apartment. And Louisa, she couldn't take it. The marriage didn't withstand the pressure. The first few months were united in grief, but gradually the estrangement became inevitable. Louisa blamed Anthony for hiring Constance, for working too much, for not being present at the time of the disappearance. Anthony, in turn, immersed himself in investigations and the company, using work as an escape valve to avoid going mad. After a year, they were sleeping in separate rooms. After 2, they signed the divorce papers. Louisa moved to Edinburgh, where her mother lived. Anthony sent money regularly, more out of guilt than legal obligation. They spoke rarely, only to exchange information about the searches they both separately still maintained. Anthony's only constant support during those years was his brother, Edward. 2 years older, Edward had always been the emotional pillar of the family since the loss of their parents in an accident when they were young. It was he who prevented Anthony from completely succumbing to despair, who convinced him to keep the company running, who served as a sympathetic ear on countless sleepless nights and nightmares. Edward never allowed Anthony to give up searching for Michael. "He's alive, I'm sure," he always said. "One day we'll find him, Anthony. Don't lose faith." And now, against all odds, Michael had appeared. Not through relentless searches, private detectives offered rewards, or media campaigns. No. Fate had simply brought father and son face to face on a sidewalk in central London. Anthony opened an office drawer and pulled out a voluminous folder. It was his personal file on the case, meticulously maintained over the years. Police reports, newspaper clippings, testimonies, photos. He flipped through until he found a photograph of Michael on the day he received the gold bracelet. The jewelry had been a special gift for the boy's 4th birthday. Anthony had had his son's name and birth date engraved, the same date he had seen today on the wrist of the frightened boy in the city centre. "It can't be a coincidence," he murmured, studying the photo. The boy on the sidewalk was older, of course, but the features were unmistakable. Louisa's same greenish eyes, the same wavy brown hair Anthony had as a child, the same dimple on the left side of his face when he gave a tense smile. Anthony picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used for almost 2 years. "Barrett Investigations," a hoarse voice answered on the other end of the line. "Barrett, it's Anthony Miller. I need you urgently." There was a moment of silence before the reply. "Mr. Miller, have you found a new lead on your son?" "I found him, Barrett. I found Michael." Half an hour later, the private investigator arrived at the apartment. Claudio Barrett was a middle-aged man, with greying hair and a face marked by years of street work. A former police officer, he had dedicated himself to Michael's disappearance case with an obstinacy that went beyond professional duty. He himself had a son, and the idea of losing him motivated him to work on the case even when Anthony could no longer pay his fees. "Tell me exactly what happened," Barrett asked, refusing the offered drink and sitting in the office armchair. Anthony narrated the encounter in detail, including the boy's comment about men in suits and the mention of Aunt Constance as his mother. "Constance?" Barrett frowned. "The same Constance who worked for you?" "It has to be. It's too much of a coincidence. The bracelet, the name, the age." Anthony ran a hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. "Someone lied to my son, Barrett. Someone made him believe I abandoned him." "Let's take it easy," the investigator said. "First, we need to confirm it's really Michael. Then find out where he's living and with whom. And only then confront these people." Anthony nodded, forcing himself to regain rationality. "You're right. Where do we start?" "From what you described, the boy works as a shoe shiner in the city centre. I'll discreetly circle the area tomorrow and try to locate him. Once I know where he lives, I'll investigate this Constance. If she's indeed your former housekeeper, there will be records." Anthony felt a mixture of hope and fear. What if he disappears again? What if, when she finds out I'm looking for him, this woman takes him away again? Barrett placed a hand on his client's shoulder in an uncharacteristic paternal gesture for his normally reserved personality. "Mr. Miller, I've waited 4 years for a concrete lead. I won't let this boy disappear again. You have my word." When the investigator left, Anthony remained in the office contemplating his son's photograph. The pain of all those years without Michael now seemed mixed with a new emotion: anger. Whoever had stolen his son and poisoned his mind with lies would pay for it. But first, he needed to regain the boy's trust, to show him that he had never abandoned him. "I'll bring you back, son," he promised, touching the image of the smiling boy in the photograph. "No matter how long it takes, I'll make you understand that I never, not for a second, stopped looking for you." The digital clock on the bedside table read 3:17 a.m. when Anthony's phone rang. He hadn't slept. He had remained seated in the bedroom armchair, watching the hours pass, reliving every moment of the unexpected encounter. "Barrett, any news?" he answered immediately, no sign of sleep in his voice. "Mr. Miller, sorry about the hour," the investigator replied, his voice sounding animated despite the time. "But I thought you'd want to know as soon as possible. I found the boy." Anthony sprang to his feet as if an electric current had coursed through his body. "Where? How is he?" "Is he with Constance?" "Calm down, mister. Let's take it one step at a time," Barrett requested. "I spent the night in the city centre. patrolling the spots where shoe shiners usually work. Around midnight, when I was about to give up for the day, I heard some boys talking in Trafalgar Square. One of them was named Michael, and by the description seemed to be your son. And you followed him? Anthony could barely contain his anxiety. Yes, discreetly. He went to a housing estate in the East End in Tower Hamlets. I stayed far back, but I managed to see which block he entered. The investigator paused as if consulting notes. I spoke with the doorman under the pretext of looking for an apartment to rent, and he confirmed to me that there's a woman named Constance Ferreira living in apartment 302, with a boy she calls her son. Constance Ferreira, Anthony murmured, feeling the confirmation of his suspicions like a punch to the stomach. It's her, Barrett. That was our housekeeper's full name. How is this possible? The police investigated her at the time. She was interrogated several times. People know how to lie, mister, Barrett replied pragmatically. And some are very good at it. But let's not jump to conclusions. We need more information. In the following 24 hours, Barrett conducted a thorough investigation. Using his contacts in the police and public agencies, he gathered data on Constance Ferreira. After leaving her job at the Miller household shortly after Michael's disappearance, she had moved to the housing estate in Tower Hamlets. She had found employment as a cleaner, then as a supermarket cashier, and currently worked part-time at a local health center as a cleaning assistant. Her financial situation is modest, but not precarious, Barrett reported, sitting again in Anthony's office the next day. The boy attends a local primary school nearby. He's in his 3rd year. From what I gathered, he's a regular student with no behavioral problems. People in the neighborhood know them both, saying they are reserved but polite. And no one ever suspected anything, Anthony questioned, incredulous. She just appeared with a 4-year-old boy out of nowhere, and no one questioned it. According to neighbors, she always said the boy was her son, that his father had abandoned them and that they came from the Scottish Highlands, Barrett explained. The most common story in the world, unfortunately. No one had reason to doubt it. Anthony shook his head, trying to process all the information. How does she support the boy? These jobs don't pay much. Here's the interesting point, Barrett said, opening a folder with documents. I found records of regular monthly deposits into her account. Small amounts but consistent, always in cash. Between £2,000 and £3,000, depending on the month. I couldn't trace the origin. Someone is paying her to keep my son, Anthony concluded, feeling his anger grow. But who? And why? Those are the questions we need to answer, Barrett agreed. But there's one more thing I discovered that you need to know. The investigator handed Anthony a medical report. Constance has chronic health problems, severe hypertension, and advanced diabetes. She receives regular treatment at the health center, takes several medications. It's not a terminal condition, but it requires constant care. Anthony studied the document, feeling torn between compassion for the sick woman and anger at the betrayal. That doesn't justify taking my son, he finally said. Nothing justifies it. Of course not, Mr. Barrett agreed. I'm just presenting all the facts. And now, what's the next step? Anthony reflected for a few moments. His immediate impulse was to call the police, storm the apartment, and forcibly retrieve his son. But that could traumatize the boy even more, who already believed he had been abandoned by his father. I want to observe my son, he finally decided. See how he lives, how he behaves before doing anything. I need to better understand the situation to know how to approach him. The next morning, Anthony was unrecognizable. He had swapped his Italian suit for faded jeans, a simple t-shirt, and a worn baseball cap. He left his beard unshaven and wore ordinary sunglasses. He looked more like a construction worker than the CEO of a supermarket chain. Following Barrett's instructions, he positioned himself in the square in front of the local primary school Michael attended. He sat on a bench, pretending to read a newspaper, while observing the gate through which the children would enter. At precisely 7:30 a.m., he saw his son arrive accompanied by a middle-aged woman, thin with graying hair tied in a simple bun. Constance looked older than her 52 years, as if time had been particularly cruel to her. She walked with slight difficulty, likely due to her health problems. Michael, in turn, was well dressed by the neighborhood standards. He wore a clean and well-ironed school uniform, good-condition trainers, and carried a new backpack. The gold bracelet remained on his wrist, gleaming discreetly under the morning light. Anthony observed the interaction between the two with a lump in his throat. Constance adjusted the boy's shirt collar, said something that made him smile, that dimple on the left side identical to his own, and kissed his forehead before letting him enter the school. There was genuine affection in that gesture, however much Anthony wanted to deny it. When the woman walked away, Anthony followed her discreetly until he saw her board a bus that would likely take her to work. Afterwards, he returned to the square and waited. At 12:30 p.m. the children began to leave, and Michael appeared, this time alone. Instead of going straight home, the boy walked a few blocks and met up with other boys in a square. Anthony approached close enough to overhear the conversation. The boys were discussing who would work at which shoe shiner spot that day. "Michael, you're staying at Leicester Square today," said an older boy. "It was busy there yesterday." "I can't stay too late," Michael replied. "I have a test tomorrow and I promised my mum I'd study." The other boys laughed and made jokes, but there was no real malice there. It was the typical camaraderie of children who share the same difficulties. Anthony followed his son from a distance to Leicester Square, where Michael set up his small shoe shiner stand and began to work. He was efficient and polite with customers, always thanking them even when they declined his services. He negotiated the price with surprising firmness for someone so young. Occasionally he shared snacks or exchanged stories with other informal workers in the square. Gathering courage, Anthony approached, still disguised. "Hi, kid. How much for a shine?" Michael looked up and smiled professionally. £15, mister." "Isn't that a bit expensive?" Anthony provoked, trying to start a conversation. "It's a fair price," Michael replied without hesitation. "I do a good job and use quality materials. If you want cheaper, there are other boys around the corner, but I can't guarantee the result." Anthony couldn't help but smile at the confident reply. He sat on the makeshift chair and placed his feet on the rest. "All right, you've convinced me." As Michael worked on his shoes, Anthony watched him intently, absorbing every detail of his lost son. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. There was no doubt it was Michael. "Have you been working as a shoe shiner for a long time?" he asked casually. "Since I was 6, Michael replied. "I help out at home with what I earn. My mum gets sick sometimes and the medicines are expensive." "Your mum must be proud to have such a hard-working son," Anthony commented, feeling a pang in his chest at calling Constance Michael's mum. "She says a real man helps at home," the boy replied proudly. "Not like my father, who abandoned us when I was little." Anthony felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach, but he maintained his composure. "And that beautiful bracelet on your arm? Did your mum give it to you?" Michael looked at the jewelry, and his expression became momentarily distant. "It was the only thing my father left for me before he left. My mum kept it to give me when I was older." He frowned as if trying to access a diffuse memory. "Sometimes I dream of a big house with a garden. But it must just be my imagination. And aren't you curious about your father?" "About what he was like?" Anthony insisted, knowing he was treading on dangerous territory. Michael's face hardened. "My mum said he was rich, an important man who didn't want a child getting in the way of his life. Men in suits like him only care about money, not about people like us." Then, as if realizing he had said too much, he quickly added, "Your shoe is ready, mister. It's sparkling." Anthony paid for the service, leaving a generous tip that made the boy's eyes light up. He desperately wanted to reveal his identity, tell the truth, embrace his son. But he knew it wasn't the right time. Michael would flee, or worse, hate him even more. After Michael finished his day's work, Anthony discreetly followed him to the housing estate in Tower Hamlets. The boy went up to the 3rd floor and entered apartment 302. Anthony waited outside the building, observing the apartment window from where he could hear fragments of conversation. "Did you study for tomorrow's test?" Constance's voice asked. "I'm going to study now, Mum," Michael replied. "Look how much I earned today." "That's good, son. Save some of it so we can buy your new supplies next month." The domestic scene was so common, so normal, that for a moment Anthony questioned his right to interfere. The boy seemed well cared for, polite, responsible. But then he remembered the terrible lie they had told Michael, the love and life they had stolen from him and Louisa. No, he couldn't allow this charade to continue. Anthony returned to his apartment in Kensington with his mind in a whirlwind. Barrett was waiting for him with a complete dossier on Constance Ferreira, employment history, medical records, bank movements from recent years. and even Michael's school report. Mr. Miller, I got more information. The woman has no criminal record, has never had problems with the law. On the contrary, she has an impeccable work history, the investigator reported, opening the folder on the coffee table. Anthony carefully examined the documents, searching for any clue that could explain the inexplicable. How could an apparently dedicated housekeeper, who had worked for the family for 10 years, have kidnapped his son? These regular deposits, he murmured, analyzing the bank statements. Someone is paying her. Someone with enough money to sustain this situation for 4 years, but not so much as to allow them to live in better conditions. An unease grew in his chest, a suspicion so disturbing that he hesitated to vocalize it. Why had they never been able to find Michael? Why did all the leads lead to dead ends? The most logical answer would be that someone close, someone who knew the steps of the investigation, was actively working to keep the boy hidden. Edward's image flashed in his mind. His brother, his only support during those years of despair. Could it be possible? No, it was absurd to even think about it. Edward loved Michael. It was he who prevented Anthony from giving up the search. Or was it precisely for that reason? To keep Anthony occupied with false hopes, while the boy grew up far away, believing he had been abandoned? "Barrett," Anthony called, trying to keep his voice steady. "I want you to investigate one more person." The investigator raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Who, mister?" "My brother, Edward Miller." Barrett looked disconcerted. "Your brother?" "But he was always your greatest support in the searches. He was the one who hired me when you were unavailable." The investigator discreetly referred to the period when Anthony had fallen into deep depression, 2 years after the disappearance. "I know," Anthony replied, tasting the bitter tang of distrust. "And that's precisely why I need to be sure. Check his financial movements, especially cash withdrawals that might correspond to the deposits in Constance's account." While waiting for the results of the new investigation, Anthony spent the hours mentally reorganizing the events of the past 4 years. He searched his memories for any suspicious behavior from Edward, any inconsistency in his actions or words. Small details previously ignored now seemed to take on new meaning. Edward knew the family's entire routine. He knew exactly when Michael would be in the garden with Constance on that fateful Sunday. It was he who always defended the housekeeper when initial suspicions fell on her. "Constance would never do that, Anthony. She adores Michael. There must be another explanation," he had said at the time. And Edward's financial problems. Anthony remembered that shortly before the disappearance, his brother had asked for a substantial loan, claiming difficulties with unsuccessful investments. Anthony granted the money without questioning, fully trusting his older brother. At 3 a.m, Barrett called. "Mister, I found something. I didn't want to wait until tomorrow to show you." 20 minutes later, the investigator entered the apartment with a grave expression. "I have bad news," he announced, placing an envelope on the table. "Your brother made regular monthly withdrawals over the past 4 years. The amounts almost exactly coincide with the deposits in Constance's account, with a difference of only 1 or 2 days between the withdrawal and the deposit." Anthony felt the ground collapse beneath his feet. He took the envelope with trembling hands and examined Edward's bank statements. Comparing them with Constance's, the correspondence was undeniable. "There's one more thing," Barrett continued hesitantly. "I found records of phone calls between your brother and a number registered in Constance's name. They aren't frequent, happening once or twice a month, but they are consistent over the years." The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that Anthony could barely breathe. Edward, his only support, his brother, the man who had dried his tears and sworn they would never give up finding Michael. Was he responsible for all his suffering? "Why?" he whispered, more to himself than to Barrett. "Why would he do this to me?" "To Michael?" "To Louisa. Only he can answer that, mister," Barrett said regretfully. "What do you intend to do now?" Anthony stood up, the decision made. "I'm going to confront him now. Mister, it's almost 4 a.m. Even better, he won't have time to prepare lies." Edward lived in a luxury condominium in Chelsea, about 20 minutes from Anthony's apartment. Throughout the drive, Anthony mentally rehearsed the confrontation, fighting the urge to simply punch his brother until he confessed. He needed answers. He needed to understand how the man he loved and fully trusted could betray him and his son so cruelly. He rang the doorbell repeatedly until he heard movement inside the apartment. Edward opened the door in a bathrobe, his hair disheveled and a sleepy expression. "Anthony, what's wrong?" "It's 4 in the morning." Anthony pushed the door open and entered the apartment without a word. His gaze, heavy with contained fury, made Edward recoil a few steps. "What's going on?" the older brother asked, now visibly concerned. "I found Michael," Anthony said, carefully observing his brother's reaction. Edward's face instantly paled. His eyes widened in panic, and he tried to disguise his reaction, forcing a smile that came out more like a grimace. "What do you mean? Where? Is he all right?" "You know exactly where he is and how he is," Anthony replied, his voice trembling with rage. "You've been paying Constance all these years to keep my son away from me." Edward opened his mouth to deny it, but no sound came out. For an instant it seemed he would faint. He staggered to the sofa and sat down, covering his face with his hands. "Anthony, I can explain—" "Explain?" Anthony laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Explain how you stole my son. How you watched me suffer day after day while knowing exactly where he was. How you allowed him to grow up believing he had been abandoned by his father." Edward raised his face, now bathed in tears. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he murmured. "At first it was just meant to be temporary." "Temporary?" Anthony repeated, incredulous. 4 years, Edward. You destroyed my family, my marriage, my life." The older brother sobbed, his expression devastated by a guilt that seemed to finally catch up to him. "I was desperate, Anthony. I owed a lot of money to dangerous people, loan sharks. They threatened me and my family. And that justifies kidnapping my son." Anthony advanced menacingly. Edward raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "No, it doesn't justify it. But at the time it seemed like the only way out. I needed time to settle my debts. I thought of faking a kidnapping to get money without you knowing it was me." Anthony sat heavily in the opposite armchair, trying to process the surreal confession. "Continue," he ordered, his voice cold as ice. Edward took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a long-buried story. "Constance and we had an affair back then, years ago. Nothing serious, just a few months after she lost a baby she was expecting with her ex-husband." Anthony frowned, surprised by this revelation. He had never known about this relationship, nor that Constance had lost a child. "When I found myself cornered by debts, I sought out Constance. She always had a special affection for Michael, almost obsessive. I proposed a plan. She would take Michael to a safe place for a few weeks, while I negotiated with the loan sharks. We would say the boy had been kidnapped, but in reality he would be protected away from danger. And she agreed to that." Anthony questioned, incredulous. "She agreed to traumatize a 4-year-old child." Edward lowered his gaze. "She was emotionally fragile since the loss of her own child. I think she saw in Michael a chance to fill that void. On the agreed day, she gave the boy a mild sedative, told Louisa he had a fever, and that she would take him to the hospital while you prepared the party. She left through the front door without raising suspicion." Anthony closed his eyes, visualizing the scene with painful clarity. "And then, she moved to the housing estate in Tower Hamlets, using false documents I obtained through contacts. The intention was to return Michael after a few months when my situation was resolved." Edward hesitated. "But then everything got out of control. You were devastated. The police intensified the searches, and Constance became attached to Michael in a way I hadn't foreseen. So you just let her keep my son." Anthony exploded, standing up again. "While I spent fortunes on investigators, while my marriage fell apart, while I could barely sleep at night wondering if my son was alive or dead. I tried to convince her to return the boy," Edward weakly defended himself. "But then I saw how Michael was adapted. He called Constance Mum, he seemed happy. And you and Louisa were so destroyed. I thought revealing the truth would only cause more pain. That wasn't your decision to make." Anthony shouted, punching the coffee table with such force that the glass cracked. "He was my son. My son, Edward." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Edward seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few minutes. "What did you tell Michael about me?" Anthony finally asked, his voice more controlled but no less pained. Edward averted his gaze, ashamed. "Constance told him that his father was a rich man who didn't want him, who had rejected him. I couldn't stop her from creating that narrative. And then over time it became the truth for the boy. Anthony felt a wave of nausea. His own son had grown up hating him for something he had never done. "How could you do this to me?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "How could you look me in the eyes all these years, pretending to support me, while knowing exactly where my son was?" "Cowardice," Edward admitted, without trying to justify himself. With each passing day, it became harder to tell the truth. And then, when I realized it, years had already gone by. The damage was done. "The damage," Anthony repeated bitterly. "Is that how you see my son?" "Damage?" Edward shook his head, defeated. "What are you going to do now?" Anthony stared at his brother with a mixture of anger, disappointment, and contempt. "What am I going to do?" "I'm going to get my son, Edward. And you're coming with me to tell him the whole truth." "It's the least you can do after everything." "Anthony, I don't think it's a good idea to just show up like that. The boy will be scared," Edward tried to argue. "You lost the right to have an opinion on what's best for my son the moment you decided to steal him from me," Anthony cut in dryly. "Tomorrow at 10 in the morning. I'll be waiting for you at the entrance of your building. If you don't show up, I'm going straight to the police." Edward bowed his head, defeated. "I'll be there." Anthony left his brother's apartment feeling simultaneously exhausted and electrified. The confirmation of Edward's betrayal was like an open wound, throbbing with pain. But knowing the truth, however terrible, also brought a strange relief. He finally understood what had happened, and that meant he could start to fix things. Upon arriving home, he called Barrett and reported his brother's confession. "I need you to come with me tomorrow. We're going to get Michael." "Mr. Miller," the investigator pondered, "considering everything you've told me, perhaps a gradual approach would be better. The boy spent 4 years believing a lie about you." "I don't have another 4 years to lose, Barrett," Anthony replied firmly. "But you're right about one thing. We need to be careful with Michael. I won't forcibly take him from that woman, however much I want to. I'll let him decide after hearing the whole truth." The next morning, Edward waited on the sidewalk as agreed, looking haggard like someone who hadn't slept all night. Barrett was in the car with Anthony, who drove in silence, his hands clutching the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. "How are you feeling?" the investigator asked, concerned about his client's emotional state. "How do you think?" Anthony retorted, before sighing and softening his tone. "Sorry, Barrett. I'm nervous, scared, furious, and above all afraid that my son will hate me forever." "Children are more understanding than we imagine," Barrett said gently, "especially when they sense sincerity. And if there's one thing I've noticed in these years working for you, it's that your love for the boy is genuine." When Edward got into the car, the heavy silence between the brothers was palpable. No one spoke during the entire journey to Tower Hamlets. They stopped a block from the housing estate, and Barrett went ahead to check if Constance and Michael were home. "The woman is there," he confirmed upon returning. "The boy must be at school at this hour." Better that way, Anthony decided. First we talk to her, understand the whole situation. When Michael returns, we'll tell him the truth together. The 3 men went up to the 3rd floor. Anthony took a deep breath before knocking on the door of apartment 302. Footsteps were heard from the other side, and then Constance's voice. "Who is it?" "Constance," Edward replied, his voice trembling. "It's me. I need to talk to you." There was a moment of silence, followed by the sound of locks being opened. The door opened slightly, revealing Constance's aged face, which instantly paled upon seeing Anthony beside Edward. "My God," she whispered, trying to close the door. Anthony firmly, but without violence, prevented the movement. "We need to talk, Constance. About Michael. My son." The woman looked as if she was about to faint. She looked at Edward with an expression of betrayal. "You promised. You promised he would never know." "Things have changed," Edward replied, unable to look her in the eyes. "He found Michael by chance. We can no longer hide the truth." After a moment of hesitation, Constance opened the door completely defeated. "Come in," she said in a faint voice. The apartment was small but extremely clean and organized. Photos of Michael at different ages decorated the walls. Michael blowing out candles on a cake. Michael in a school uniform, Michael in a park. An entire life that Anthony had lost. "Why, Constance?" he asked. his voice choked with emotion at seeing the images of his son growing up without him. "Why did you do this to me?" "To Michael? You worked in our house for 10 years. You saw this boy born. How could you?" The woman sat on the worn sofa, her trembling hands crossed on her lap. "So you wouldn't understand?" "Try," Anthony insisted, sitting in front of her. "Because I spent 4 years trying to understand how my son simply disappeared without a trace." Constance looked at Edward, who nodded slightly, as if encouraging her to speak. "I lost a child," she began, her voice almost inaudible. "I was 8 months pregnant when I had a problem. The baby was stillborn. That was around the time I started working for your family." Anthony vaguely remembered that period. Constance had taken a few weeks of medical leave shortly after being hired, but had never mentioned the real reason. "Edward and we had an affair back then," she continued, avoiding looking at Anthony. "He was the one who helped me overcome the loss. When he sought me out years later, saying he was in trouble, that dangerous people were threatening him, I couldn't refuse to help." "So you just agreed to kidnap my son?" Anthony questioned, incredulous. "It wasn't supposed to be a kidnapping." Constance defended herself, tears beginning to stream. "It was just temporary to protect Michael. Edward said these people could harm his family, including his nephew, that it was safer to keep the boy away for a while." "And you believed that?" Anthony shook his head, incredulous. "I believed it because I wanted to believe it," Constance admitted. I always loved Michael as if he were my own. Since he was a baby, when I rocked him to sleep, when I stayed with him while you and Louisa went out, he filled the void of the child I lost." The confession, however disturbing, had a tone of sincerity that Anthony couldn't ignore. This woman had in fact cared for his son with dedication, even if motivated by a sick obsession. "And then, when temporary became permanent?" he asked, trying to maintain his composure. "Weeks turned into months," Edward interjected. "I kept promising Constance that we would sort everything out soon, that we would return Michael. But time passed and the boy adapted. He called me Mum," Constance added, with a mixture of guilt and affection. "He forgot almost everything about his previous life. He was so small, and I couldn't imagine life without him anymore. So you simply decided to keep him." Anthony's indignation grew with each new revelation, "and started poisoning his mind against me." Constance lowered her head, ashamed. "He started asking questions about his father after he started school and saw other children with their dads. I said his father was a rich man who didn't want him, who had abandoned us." "Why, Constance, why this specific cruelty?" The woman raised her tear-filled eyes. "Because it was the only way to ensure he wouldn't try to look for him. If he believed his father rejected him, he wouldn't have a reason to want to return." Anthony felt a physical pain upon hearing those words. His own son had been conditioned to hate him, to fear men like him. "And when did he start asking about the bracelet?" he inquired, remembering the accessory that had led to this entire reunion. "I said it was the only thing his father had left before he left," Constance replied. "That I kept it so he would at least have a memory. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. It was very beautiful and it had his name on it." A heavy silence fell over the room. Anthony tried to process everything he had heard, the complex web of lies, half-truths, and distorted justifications that had stolen 4 years of his life with his son. The sound of the front door opening cut the tension. Michael entered the apartment, wearing his school uniform, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He stopped abruptly upon seeing the 3 men with his adoptive mother, his eyes widening in recognition and fear. "The rich man," he whispered, backing away to the door. His eyes darted from Anthony to Edward, then to Constance, who was crying silently. "What's happening, Mum?" Constance extended her hand to the boy, her face contorted in an expression of pain. "Michael, son, we need to talk." "I don't want to talk to them," the boy declared, his voice trembling with fear. "You said men in suits hurt children like me." Anthony felt his heart clench upon hearing those words. With a slow and deliberate movement, he removed his jacket and loosened his tie, then knelt on the floor, putting himself at his son's eye level. "Michael," he called softly, "I promise I won't hurt you. I never would, and I won't take you anywhere by force. I just want to talk, that's all." The boy looked suspiciously at Constance, seeking guidance. The woman, through tears, nodded slightly. "Why does he know my name?" Michael asked, still reluctant to approach. Why did he look for me on the street that day? Anthony took a deep breath, knowing the crucial moment had arrived. Michael, there are things about your past that you don't know. Things that Constance and Edward need to tell you. The boy frowned, confused. Do you know each other? Edward stepped forward, his expression devastated by guilt. Michael, I am your uncle. Your father's brother. The boy's eyes widened in shock. He looked at Constance, seeking a denial that didn't come. Is this true, Mum? The woman sobbed, unable to speak. Anthony seized the moment to carefully step forward. Michael, the truth is you weren't abandoned. You were taken from us when you were 4 years old. I never gave up looking for you. Not for a single day. No, the boy protested, shaking his head in denial. My mum said my father didn't want me, that he left us because we were a burden to him. Michael, Constance called, finally finding her voice. I lied to you. Your father never abandoned you. The boy seemed lost, looking from one adult to another in search of a truth he could cling to. I don't understand. If you're not my mum, then who is? I took care of you all these years, Constance replied, her voice choked. I love you like a son, but your real mother is named Louisa Miller, and this man is Anthony Miller, your biological father. Michael looked at Anthony, really looked for the first time. The same eyes, the same face shape, the same dimple on the left side when he gave a tense smile. If you're my real father, he asked with a trembling voice, why did they take me? Why did they lie to me? It's a complicated story, Anthony replied cautiously. But I think your Uncle Edward and Constance need to tell their part first. Edward knelt beside Anthony, his eyes red from crying a lot. Michael, I did something terrible. I was in trouble. Money problems. I owed dangerous people. I asked Constance for help to keep you safe for a while, until everything was resolved. I agreed, Constance continued. At first it was meant to be temporary, but then I couldn't bring myself to return him. I loved you too much, Michael, and I was afraid of losing you. The boy processed each word with an expression of growing confusion and pain. You lied to me, all of you. Yes, Edward admitted, unable to meet his nephew's accusing gaze. And there's no excuse for it. What we did was wrong. Your father never abandoned you, Michael. On the contrary, he spent these 4 years searching for you tirelessly. I don't believe you, the boy declared, tears finally escaping. Why should I believe anything now? Anthony took his wallet from his pocket and extracted a photograph from it. He handed it to his son. This is you at 4 years old on your birthday, the day you received the bracelet you're wearing. Michael stood paralyzed, staring at the photograph as if it were an alien object. His fingers traced the outline of the image, resting on the face of the smiling boy who was himself 4 years ago. A fragment of memory seemed to awaken. The taste of a chocolate cake, the sensation of the bracelet's cold metal touching his skin for the first time, a deep voice saying, Happy birthday, champ. I remember a little, he murmured, his voice almost inaudible. Of the big house, of the garden, of a dog. He looked at Anthony, hesitant. Did we have a dog? Yes, Anthony confirmed with an emotional smile. A Labrador named Tobias. He was your best friend. You slept together almost every night. Michael frowned, as if trying to access deeply buried memories. And my mum? My real mum? Her name is Louisa, Anthony replied delicately. She currently lives in Edinburgh with your grandmother. She never gave up on you, Michael. Just like me. The boy looked again at Constance, who was crying silently on the sofa, then at Edward, kneeling with an expression of deep regret, and finally at Anthony, whose face reflected hope and fear in equal measure. I don't know what to think, Michael confessed, his voice choked. I don't know who to believe anymore. Believe the facts, Barrett interjected, speaking for the first time. He handed a folder to the boy. These are newspaper reports about your disappearance. Missing child posters that your father spread across the country. Records of the investigations, the searches. Your father never stopped looking for you, not for a single day. Michael took the folder with trembling hands and began to leaf through the documents. He saw his younger face plastered in newspapers, on missing posters, in printed television reports. He saw the pain on his parents' faces, the despair in interviews, the public appeals for information. When he finished examining the documents, his face was streaked with tears. He looked at Constance with an expression that mixed anger and confusion. "You lied to me. The whole time." The woman nodded, unable to deny it. "I lied, Michael. But the love I felt for you was always true. I took care of you as best I could, but what we did was wrong. And your father deserves the chance to be with you." Michael recoiled a few steps, visibly overwhelmed by the revelations. "I need to be alone. I need to think." Without waiting for a reply, he ran to a small room at the back of the apartment and closed the door. The adults heard the sound of crying coming from inside. "He needs time," Barrett said, placing a hand on Anthony's shoulder. "It's a lot to process all at once." Anthony nodded, his heart aching at hearing his son's cries. "I'm not leaving," he declared firmly. "I'll wait as long as it takes." During the following hours, the four adults remained in the small living room in an uncomfortable silence, occasionally broken by Anthony's attempts to talk to his son through the closed door. "Michael, I'm out here whenever you want to talk." "I'm not leaving. I promise I'll never leave you alone again." It was already past 5 in the afternoon when the bedroom door finally opened. Michael appeared, his eyes red from crying so much, but with a calmer, almost resolute expression. "I have 2 questions," he announced, stopping in the center of the room. "And I want everyone to answer me with the truth." "No more lies," the adults nodded, attentive. "First, why did you take me?" "The whole truth." Edward stepped forward, taking responsibility. "I owed money to dangerous people, Michael. Loan sharks. They threatened to harm my family if I didn't pay. I thought of faking a kidnapping to buy time, convincing your father to pay the ransom, which would actually go to the loan sharks. I convinced Constance to help, saying it was to protect you. And you?" Michael turned to Constance. The woman took a deep breath. "I lost a child years before, Michael, a baby who was stillborn. When your uncle asked for my help, I saw an opportunity to have the child I lost. It was selfish, it was wrong. I knew it, but I couldn't stop." Michael processed the information for a moment, then asked the second question. "If I want to go back to my real family, what will happen to Aunt Constance?" Anthony exchanged a look with Barrett before answering carefully. "Legalmente, what they did was a crime. They could go to prison." "Are you going to have them arrested?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. Anthony observed his son for a long moment, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes. Despite everything, Michael had developed a bond with Constance, who had cared for him for 4 years. "That depends partly on what you want, Michael," he finally replied, "and also on what's best for you. The most important thing now is your well-being." Michael nodded, thoughtful. After a long silence, he said, "I have 2 conditions." "What are they?" Anthony asked, surprised by his son's firmness. "First, never lie to me again, about anything. Second, don't force me to be separated from Aunt Constance. She took care of me." Anthony felt a wave of admiration for his son. Even in that impossible situation, Michael showed surprising compassion and maturity. "I promise," he replied sincerely, "I will never lie to you again, and I won't separate you from Constance by force. We can find a solution that considers everyone's feelings, especially yours." Michael hesitated, then asked timidly, "Can I talk to my mum? My real mum?" Anthony felt his eyes well up. "Of course you can," he replied, picking up his phone. He dialed Louisa's number with trembling fingers. After a few rings, a female voice was heard on the other end of the line. "Anthony? Is something wrong?" "Louisa," he said, his voice choked. "I found our son. I found Michael. And he wants to talk to you." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of suppressed crying. Anthony handed the phone to Michael, who held it as if it was something precious and fragile. "Hello?" the boy said, hesitant. "Mum?" The conversation that followed was long and emotional. Michael listened more than he spoke, absorbing the voice of the mother he didn't consciously remember, but which somehow felt familiar. Louisa sang a lullaby she used to use to put him to sleep as a baby, and something in that melody awakened deep memories in the boy, who began to cry silently. When the call ended, almost an hour later, Michael seemed different, calmer, more centered, as if he had finally found an anchor amidst the whirlwind of revelations. "Why did you take me?" he asked Edward and Constance directly, now that he had heard his parents' version. Why did you do this to us? Edward lowered his head, ashamed. Bad people took advantage of a situation of weakness, Michael. I owed money to dangerous men, and they threatened to harm my family. Instead of asking your father for help, I chose the wrong path. And you? Michael turned to Constance. The woman wiped away her tears before replying. I lost a baby, Michael. The pain was so great that it made me accept something terrible. I have no excuses for what I did, only regret and the love I feel for you, which was always true. The boy nodded slowly, processing the explanations. Then he turned to Anthony. What happens now? That's up to you, his father replied gently. You can choose to live with me or with your mother, or alternate between us both. We can also find a way to keep in touch with Constance, if that's what you wish. The important thing is that you feel safe and loved. Michael reflected for a moment. I wanted to see the house where I used to live. See what it's like. We can go right now if you want, Anthony offered, feeling a wave of hope. The boy looked at Constance, who nodded, despite her tears. Go, son. See your real home. You deserve that. 3 days later, Michael entered the mansion where he was born for the first time in 4 years. Louisa returned from Edinburgh immediately to participate in this crucial moment of reunion. The boy walked through the rooms in silence, touching objects, observing photographs, trying to reconnect with his past. Some things awakened fragmented memories, the smell of the kitchen, the creak of a particular door, the texture of the stair railing. Others seemed completely new. Anthony and Louisa accompanied him without pressure, allowing him to explore at his own pace. Where's my room? He finally asked. They led him to his old room, preserved exactly as it was on the day of his disappearance. The toys in the same places, the bed with the same superhero sheets, the children's books neatly arranged on the shelf. Michael sat on the bed, touching the objects, absorbing the strange familiarity of that space. I want to stay here, he said after a long silence, but not in this room. It's strange, like it belongs to someone else. Anthony and Louisa exchanged understanding glances. We can prepare another room for you, his mother suggested, one that reflects who you are now. Michael nodded, grateful for their understanding. Can I visit Aunt Constance sometimes? Of course you can, Anthony replied, though the idea was still painful for him. She took care of you all these years. That bond doesn't have to be completely broken. In the following weeks, the adaptation was gradual and not without difficulties. Michael was enrolled in a private school near the mansion, but faced socialization problems. Nightmares were frequent, and he often woke up calling for Constance. A child psychologist specializing in trauma was hired to help him process everything that had happened. Constance and Edward faced legal consequences for their actions. After much reflection, and considering Michael's well-being, Anthony chose not to pursue the maximum penalty, but demanded that both take full responsibility. Edward was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in the plan, while Constance received a 3-year sentence, considering the care she had provided to the boy during the time she kept him. Michael visited Constance in prison monthly, always accompanied by Anthony or Louisa. On the 3rd visit, something fundamental happened. The boy told his former caregiver that he forgave her for the lie, but that he had decided to stay with his biological family. You taught me that family is who cares for us with love, he told the woman, with a wisdom beyond his years. And now I have 2. 1 year after the reunion, Michael was completely adapted to his new life. He made friends at school, excelled in his studies, and developed a passion for swimming. Therapy sessions helped him cope with conflicting feelings and build a healthy identity. Anthony and Louisa, who had separated under the weight of their son's loss, gradually reconnected. The love they felt for each other, though damaged by years of pain, had never completely disappeared. Michael's presence acted as a catalyst for reconciliation, which occurred on more solid and mature foundations. At Michael's 10th birthday party, he surprised everyone by declaring that he no longer felt anger towards Edward and Constance. They did something very wrong, he said simply, but they also gave me care and affection. I learned that people can do bad things when they are scared or sad, and that doesn't mean they are entirely bad. This understanding didn't come overnight, but was the result of months of honest conversations with his parents and his therapist. Michael learned that forgiving didn't mean erasing the past, but rather freeing himself to build a better, future. Over time, the wounds began to heal for everyone involved. Edward served his sentence, and upon release from prison dedicated himself to working on social projects with vulnerable children, seeking to make amends for the harm he had caused. Constance, after serving her sentence, settled into a modest life, occasionally receiving visits from Michael on special dates. At 13, Michael was an exemplary teenager, studious, compassionate, and surprisingly well-adjusted, considering everything he had been through. In a school essay about his future plans, he declared that he wanted to be a lawyer to help families in situations similar to his own. "I want to build bridges where others only see walls," he wrote. "I want to transform the pain I experienced into something that can help other people." When he turned 14, during an intimate family gathering, Anthony gave a brief speech that moved everyone. "Michael, you taught me that true love is stronger than any betrayal, any pain. You taught me to forgive when I thought it would be impossible, and you brought me back to life when I thought it was over. Thank you, son, for showing me the way back home." Michael, with tears in his eyes, replied before everyone, "It was your perseverance that brought us here. Dad, it was your love that never gave up, even when all seemed lost. That showed me that even in the most difficult times there is always hope." And so, against all odds, a family shattered by betrayal and lies found its way back to wholeness. It was not the same family as before. The scars would remain forever. But it was a stronger, wiser family, infinitely grateful for the second chance that fate had granted them.